Next, I'm going to show you how you can use the pooling and timing systems in Infohazard.Core to make a object spawner. So let's just create a new game object, call it spawner, and I have a spawner script that I'm going to attach to it. Currently the spawner script does absolutely nothing, so let's first add an object that we want to spawn. Alright, so now we have that here. I'm just going to select this sphere prefab, and you can see that there's absolutely nothing out of the ordinary in this prefab. It's just a rigid body, a collider, and a mesh. So we have our spawner, and we need to give it some kind of drop rate and have it actually spawn this thing. I'm going to set up the drop rate using a field, or using a type called a passive timer. Call it spawn timer. Back in Unity, you can see that now we have the spawn timer that appears here with 3 fields. First, we have the initial interval, which I'm going to set to 2. Then the subsequent interval, which I'm going to set as 0.5. And finally, the mode, which I'm going to keep as scaled. This initial interval is basically the time that has to pass before the first time that this timer is considered elapsed. So in this case, 2 seconds will pass before the first time we spawn a sphere. Then after that, 0.5 seconds will pass between each subsequent spawn. This mode basically tells us that we're using the Unity scaled time, so if you slow down the time scale, this timer will slow down again as well. If we don't want it to be infected by the scaling of Unity time, we can use the unscaled mode, or we could even use real time if we wanted to. Personally, I like to keep this as scaled for most use cases. So in our spawner script, let's go ahead and use that timer. First thing we need to do is in a start function, add a call to initialize. This is important to do so that this timer knows what time the object was initialized at. Otherwise, it would have no idea when to start counting down. Then in our update function, you can say if spawn timer.interval ended is interval ended. This basically says if the current interval that the spawn timer is counting down has passed, then we want to instantiate spawn prefab at the transform position and transform rotation of self. And then finally we need to start the next countdown of the spawn timer. So we say spawn timer.start interval. So this will first check if the timer the current interval is ended, spawn, and if it has ended, then we restart the interval of the timer. So let's take a look at this. You can see it's not visible in the main view, but it waits a couple seconds and then starts spawning these spheres. And these spheres are never going to disappear. They just live forever. This could be bad, especially if I drop the interval, so it's just spawning a ton of them, and pretty quickly this is going to bog stuff down, and the computer is not going to be happy. So let's go ahead and despawn those spheres after a certain amount of time. To do that, I can use an included component called time to live. This will basically just destroy the object after the time I set, which in this case is 2 seconds. So now if I run this, you can see that once they start spawning, there are never more than 4. They just die, they just get destroyed after 2 seconds. Okay, so this is now going to not get absolutely horrible with the memory and stuff, but if we're still spawning a bunch of them, like spawning one every frame, then especially if this is a really complex prefab, this could still be quite slow. if we're having to like load a bunch of components and stuff every time we spawn one of these and then allocate all that memory and deallocate it later, that's still going to cause some pretty severe performance issues. So what we can do about that is use a technique called pooling. To pool these objects in Infohazard.Core, all you have to do is say spawnable.spawn. So we basically just replace the call to instantiate with this spawnable.spawn method. That will do the same thing as instantiate for now, because this prefab that we are using hasn't actually been registered with the pooling system. So if I run the game, go back to the scene, nothing's actually going to be changed now. If I click one of these spheres, you can see that after its time passes, it just gets destroyed as normal. In order to actually use pooling with it, we need to open the sphere and add the spawnable component. Don't have to do any setup here. And now, just with that one component, it should use the pooling system. So you can see that now we have this pool manager object that was automatically created for us. And if I select a sphere, then you can see that this sphere never actually becomes deselected because this one object is getting reused. It hits the bottom and then it just gets respawned back at the top. So now the system is never creating or destroying these spheres, it's just reusing them over and over again. So that can be really helpful to avoid unnecessary allocations. All right, so that is it for the pooling and timing systems. So stay tuned for the next and final video where I will be going over the unique name system.